the poor, the sick, the lowborn, the ugly. These are typically categories that one might readily associate with being an outcast. And outcasts have, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, always played an important, pivotal role in human civilization. It's not the role that they think they have, and it's not the role that most people, at least consciously, actively think that they have, those people who happen not to be outcasts, but they nonetheless play an important role. So, what is that role, and how does the modern incel fit into that? Because I think there's a very interesting dynamic going on here. So first we have to ask the question as to why such people constitute outcasts. Why are people like that unwanted? Well, they don't fit in, right? Very, very poor people are typically homeless, for example. Not always, but frequently. Do you remember that feeling when you were younger and you'd walk by homeless people? Well, they're usually ignored, completely so. Or very occasionally you would think, how did that guy end up homeless? How did he end up in this situation? People who are sick are shunned for obvious reasons, contagious diseases or what have you, and lack of health. Lack of health, from an evolved perspective, can readily be associated with lack of genetic prospects. In terms of the lowborn, of course, it's a little different because it has a lot more to do with social engineering and structure of society, but they were not allowed to ascend, say, in an Indian caste system in former times. And then you have the ugly, who probably were always a kind of outcast, but not in the sense of today. Getting back to the example of the indigent, the so-called bum, the beggar, the poor guy, the homeless guy, there's a thought process that some people have occasionally when they actually reflect. Again, most people don't consciously think about this, but when they actually reflect that, how did this guy in fact become homeless? What happened? What was his path that led him down that route? And in thinking about this, it's entirely possible, eminently plausible, that you might, as an individual who's not homeless, who's not an indigent, not poor, think, that could just happen to me too. Something along those lines, a set of circumstances, a concatenation of events could occur that would render me homeless as well. And so in a sense, that homeless guy is shining a mirror back at you for a potentiality that is yet to arrive, and may, admittedly, never arrive, but nonetheless, he's shining a mirror back at you, telling you, this is how you could end up too. It's possible that you lose your job. It's possible that you lose your income, and it's possible that you can't find work in the future. All of these things could very easily result in homelessness. You could be a beggar and a bum on the street too. You can fall ill, of course. And if you have people in your life who care about you, they'll try to take care of you. They'll take you to the hospital, etc., etc. But in the most visceral sense, with respect to contagious diseases, what happens there is you don't want to get sick yourself. It's a worry, a fear for your own health. The lowborn, it's a little bit different. Like I said, social situation, but it was very much extant in history. What about the ugly? Well, it seems as if it's an immutable state. You are born with a certain set of genes. There's some environmental influence, but by and large, your looks are determined by your genes, for the most part. It doesn't seem as flexible as the category of the indigent. You could lose your job, lose your home, you end up homeless. People are not entirely, but largely born into the capacity of being ugly, or alternatively, the capacity of being beautiful and attractive, and every which way in between. Where's the mirror there? What is the mirror of the ugly person, the aesthetic reject, particularly in a contemporary setting? What is the mirror being shown back at? People who look down upon them, the incel, as it were, the social, physical reject, who want something, but nonetheless cannot get it. For one thing, the other categories, as I mentioned, are more flexible. You can enter into a state of poverty, You can leave a state of poverty, at least potentially. You can enter into a state of illness. You can leave a state of illness. The low-born thing, again, historical circumstance. Seemingly, ugliness is not the case. There is something different about it, because there's very little you can do. What about if you're very short? If you're very short, there are some crazy operations you can engage in, but by and large, prior to the advent of this type of technology that could enable such things, there was no such option. It was just the way it was. You were short, you dealt with it. In all these categories, there's always that problem of self-extrapolation, the inability to relate to somebody else, because your circumstances and your situation are so fundamentally distinct and different. Which is why somebody like the great Lord Pete, Lord of Gingers and Chadslayer, talks about empathy. But also it's simply a fact of human existence. There's no version of you that can truly grasp me, and there's no version of me that can truly grasp you as an individual. We are cut off from each other. But the thing about the incel, the ugly guy, the short guy, the reject, is that you see a combination of a lack of empathy being projected onto them. But on top of that, there's something else going on. People like that remind others that it's entirely possible to be unloved and unwanted. People don't like thinking about that. People really don't like to think about the very distinct possibility. There are individuals out there for whom, quote-unquote, love, relationships, and in some cases even friendship, healthy social relationships, are effectively a nigh impossibility. They don't like thinking about that. And so they talk about these things in platitudes. They assume there's a universal there. In German, there's a silly expression, for example, precisely about this. They say, for every pot, there's a cover to that pot, which is to say, you have a pot, and you will find a fitting cover to make sure that the pot doesn't boil over. That's basically how it works, right? This idea that everyone can find somebody, and there's always somebody out there. That's simply not the case. We know this manifestly to not be the case. Yet many people cling to this delusion and illusion. It is comfortable for them. What happens when people come along and say, it's not the case for me? When they say, no, I've tried, I've made an effort, I've done this and that, and yet nothing came of it. Well, the baseline assumption, of course, is that that's readily available to all people. So any individual who claims he's tried, made a sincere effort, and has been rejected, that individual becomes blameworthy because his efforts are immaterial. There's something wrong with him because allegedly this good love, companionship, relationships is, it is claimed, universally available and accessible to people. But people don't want to be reminded of the fact that that's not the case. They don't, perhaps, in the deepest recesses of their minds, don't want to be reminded that they could be like that guy too. They could end up lonely, isolated, without friends or lovers. Nobody wants to think about that. Not really. And for the most part, they don't. They have their superficial thoughts. They have their so-called axioms about human society and interaction, and they run with them. They rarely think beyond that. They rarely think more deeply. But occasionally they might. People who are outcasts remind people of what they could be, potentially, and what they do not want to become. Nobody wants to become sick. Nobody wants to become homeless. Although ugliness and beauty are largely immutable, it is possible, for example, that a Chad might have a horrible car accident and be disfigured. And then he enters into the ugliness category. Then he loses all of his benefits. It's still a potential that exists. I don't wish such a fate upon anyone, whatever I think of that person. However, it's still a potential. Nobody wants to consider what that could be. And so I think a lot of the platitudes that have been built up over the years regarding this issue, and others, for example, this idea that to be poor is a de facto state of you being lazy or something along those lines. The fact that you might have been homeless at some point in time is a condemnation of your lack of diligence, the fact that you didn't want to work hard enough. That's the claim, of course. I'm not making that claim. That's what people think, and that's what they assert. And likewise, the guy who's tried every method, which way of Sunday, to succeed in the social game, the relationship game, and yet has failed, reminds people of a potential that they don't want to think about. Nobody wants to think about the possibility of how horrible it could be to be unwanted and unloved. And because of that, there's that reflex to just say, if that's actually the case, you deserve it. You're such a bad human being in their eyes that you either have not made the right effort, because obviously anyone can get access to this great good, or if not, you're such human refuse that you didn't warrant that, and therefore I don't need to give my attention to you. But the fear is always, to my mind, in those dark recesses of human consciousness, in the back of their minds. They don't want to think what it's like, because everyone at some point in time has been there, in some way, shape, or form. They've been isolated, alone, gutted. And at least for a brief moment of time in their lives, they too knew that feeling, and they never want to be reminded of that again. Enter the incel, who says, hello, that is my life. Emotional destitution, isolation, loneliness, lovelessness, that is my life, and that will be my life until I drop dead. Nobody wants to hear about that, because it reflects a potential for everyone, and everyone has been in those shoes, however briefly, and they never want to be reminded of that. Because on some level, being wanted, both romantically, socially, even in an emotional sense, a human sense, is the highest good. There's money, there are all these other things. But that doesn't translate into being wanted as an individual necessarily. And no one wants to dwell upon the possibility that they as an individual are not wanted, that they could be rejected wholesale, entirely from the game, ejected from society, condemned to live in an emotional gutter. It's easier to dismiss that than it is to think about that possibility. That is the incel mirror. That is the mirror of the outcast, the ugly, the reject, shown back at these people. And they will do everything. They will kick, they will scratch, they will fight to not countenance that thought for more than a second, which is why the reject will never be understood, not properly, with very, very few exceptions. People who go the mile, people who make a tremendous effort for whatever reason. That is not 99% of the population. The vast majority of people will never do that. They're afraid. They're afraid that they too could end up that way. So why think about it? As always, thank you for tuning in. Please leave a like, comment, share, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. May the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.